There are moments in history where the evidence survives, but the explanation does not. Across the world, archaeologists, historians, and scientists continue to study events, structures, and civilizations that left clear traces, yet no clear answers. In this documentary, we move through 19 such mysteries, from ancient technologies that vanished, to cultures that collapsed together, to monuments whose purpose is still debated today. These are not legends or speculation, but real cases where the past stops explaining itself. Wherever you're watching from, and whatever time it is for you right now.
Disappearance of the Anasazi. In the high desert of the American Southwest, there are stone villages built into sheer cliff faces, towers rising from canyon floors, and entire communities carved directly into rock, all standing silent in places where no one lives anymore. These structures belong to the people archaeologists once called the Anasazi, now more respectfully referred to as the ancestral Puebloans, a society that thrived for centuries, and then, without a clear moment of collapse, vanished from the places they had inhabited for generations. The disappearance of the ancestral Puebloans is not marked by destruction. Their homes were not burned, their settlements were not conquered, and their tools were not left scattered in panic. Instead, they appear to have been deliberately abandoned. Rooms were emptied, doors were sealed, ladders were removed. In many places, the final occupation layers show careful closure rather than sudden flight. This immediately challenges the idea of catastrophe. The ancestral Puebloans built some of the most remarkable architecture in North America. At sites like Mesa Verde, Chaco Canyon, and Canyon de Chelly, they constructed multi-story stone dwellings, sophisticated road systems, ceremonial kivas, and complex water management features in an environment that required precise knowledge of climate and resources. These were not primitive shelters. They were planned communities sustained by agriculture, trade, and ritual. Chaco Canyon, in particular, stands out as something extraordinary. Massive great houses were built with stone blocks transported from distant sources, aligned with solar and lunar cycles, and connected by straight roads that extended for kilometers across difficult terrain. This level of organization suggests regional coordination rather than isolated villages. And yet, by the end of the 13th century, these places were largely empty. One explanation often proposed is drought. Tree ring data shows that the region experienced prolonged periods of reduced rainfall, including a severe drought in the late 1200s. For agricultural societies dependent on corn, beans, and squash, this would have created enormous pressure. Crop failures would have led to food shortages, social stress, and migration. Drought, however, doesn't tell the whole story. The ancestral Puebloans had survived droughts before. They adapted by relocating fields, storing food, and adjusting settlement patterns. The scale of abandonment suggests that something more than environmental stress was at work, or that environmental stress interacted with other forces in a way that made staying untenable. Evidence of social tension appears in the archaeological record during the final centuries of occupation. Defensive architecture becomes more common. Settlements shift to more inaccessible locations, including cliff dwellings that are difficult to reach and easy to defend. This suggests concern about security, whether from internal conflict, competition over resources, or external threats. Even so, there is little evidence of large-scale warfare. There are no mass graves, no widespread destruction, and no signs of conquest by an invading force. The violence that does appear is localized and sporadic, not indicative of collapse through war. Another factor may have been social transformation. Chaco Canyon appears to have functioned as a ceremonial and administrative center rather than a conventional city. Its influence depended on shared belief systems, ritual participation, and long-distance exchange. If those belief systems weakened, or if regional communities withdrew from centralized authority, the entire system could unravel without physical destruction. In this scenario, the disappearance was not sudden. It was gradual disengagement. People did not vanish. They moved. Modern Pueblo peoples, including the Hopi, Zuni, and Rio Grande Pueblo communities, trace their ancestry to the ancestral Puebloans. Oral histories describe migrations guided by spiritual instruction, environmental signs, and the need to find balance. These traditions do not speak of collapse, but of journey and renewal. From this perspective, abandonment was not failure. It was continuation. This reframes the mystery entirely. The question is not why the Anasazi disappeared, but why they left certain places behind. Settlements were not ends in themselves. They were stages in a longer cultural movement. When conditions changed, staying was not required to preserve identity. Archaeology struggles with this idea because it expects permanence. Cities are assumed to grow, fall, and leave ruins behind. The ancestral Puebloans appear to have operated under a different logic, one in which places were sacred for a time, fulfilled their role, and were then closed. Many dwellings show signs of ritual closure. Kivas were sealed. Entryways were intentionally blocked. Items were removed rather than discarded. These actions suggest decision rather than desperation. The silence left behind can feel unsettling to modern observers. We stand in these empty rooms and expect a final moment of drama, some visible explanation carved into the stone. Instead, we find absence, order, and restraint. This restraint may be the most important clue. The ancestral Puebloans did not leave in chaos. They did not erase themselves. They carried their knowledge, stories, and identities forward into new landscapes. What they abandoned was not their civilization, but specific places that no longer served their needs or beliefs. The ruins remained because they were not destroyed. They were respected enough to be left intact. Disappearance of the Anasazi becomes less a mystery of vanishing, and more a lesson in how societies adapt. Not all civilizations end through collapse or conquest. Some end chapters of their history intentionally, choosing movement over permanence and continuity over stone. The people did not disappear, only their cities did. And in the quiet of the canyons, those empty walls still reflect a choice that modern history often forgets was possible. The Green Children of Woolpit. In the 12th century, in the rural village of Woolpit in eastern England, an event was recorded by multiple medieval chroniclers that, even by the standards of the time, resisted easy explanation. It did not involve kings, battles, or miracles performed by saints, but something far quieter and more unsettling. 2 children appeared suddenly in the fields near the village, alone, frightened, unable to communicate clearly, and marked by a physical feature that no one present could explain. Their skin was green. According to the accounts written by Ralph of Coggeshall and William of Newburgh, both respected chroniclers of the period, the children were discovered during harvest season near a series of wolf pits from which the village took its name. They were dressed in unfamiliar clothing, made of strange fabric, and they spoke a language that no one in the village recognized. When offered food, they refused everything except raw green beans, which they consumed eagerly. The villagers, uncertain what to do, took the children in and cared for them. Over time, the boy became ill and died, but the girl survived. As she adapted to village life, her skin gradually lost its green color, and she learned to speak English. It was only then that she was able to describe where she believed they had come from. Her explanation only deepened the mystery. The girl claimed that she and her brother came from a land where the sun never shone brightly, where everything existed in a kind of perpetual twilight. She described a place where all the inhabitants were green like them, and where the light was dim rather than dark. According to her account, the children had been tending animals when they heard a loud noise, became disoriented, and suddenly found themselves in the fields near Woolpit. This description did not correspond to any known location. Medieval writers did not dismiss the story as fantasy. They recorded it alongside other historical events, treating it as something unusual but real. This is important because medieval chroniclers were selective about what they considered worthy of record. While they accepted the existence of miracles, they were also careful observers of political and social events. The inclusion of the green children suggests the incident was taken seriously by those who witnessed it. Over time, interpretations of the story have multiplied. Some modern historians suggest the children were Flemish immigrants, displaced during regional conflict, who spoke an unfamiliar language and suffered from malnutrition. Green skin, in this view, could be explained by hypochromic anemia, a condition caused by severe iron deficiency, which can give the skin a greenish pallor. The children's preference for green beans may reflect familiarity rather than symbolism. This explanation has merit, but it does not resolve every detail. If the children were Flemish, their language would have been unfamiliar, but still structurally recognizable. The description suggests something more radically different. The girl's account of a land without sunlight also remains difficult to reconcile with known geography, even metaphorically. Another interpretation views the story as allegorical, a moral or religious tale symbolizing spiritual ignorance and conversion. The green skin represents estrangement from Christian truth, while the loss of color reflects integration into proper society. Medieval literature often used symbolism this way, yet this explanation struggles with the specificity of the accounts. The chroniclers named locations, behaviors, and outcomes with a level of detail unusual for pure allegory. There's also the possibility of misunderstanding layered onto truth. Medieval people lacked modern medical knowledge, and unfamiliar accents or conditions could quickly become exaggerated through retelling. What began as a strange but explainable encounter may have evolved into something more mysterious as it passed from witness to writer. Still, the fact remains that two independent chroniclers recorded the event separately, both treating it as historical rather than mythical. This lends the story weight even if it does not provide clarity. From a human perspective, what makes the Green Children of Woolpit endure is not the green skin itself, but the way the event resisted classification. The villagers did not know what the children were. They did not immediately assign them to known categories such as foreigners, orphans, or criminals. They simply cared for them and tried to understand. The girl's eventual integration into society did not erase the mystery. She lived the rest of her life in England, married, and became part of the community, yet her origin remained unexplained. No homeland was ever identified. No similar cases were recorded nearby. The story ends not with resolution, but with assimilation. Modern fascination with the green children often pushes the story toward speculation, involving parallel worlds or subterranean civilizations. These interpretations reflect contemporary imagination rather than medieval belief. The original sources do not suggest anything supernatural beyond unfamiliarity itself, and that may be the point. The green children represent a moment where difference appeared suddenly, without explanation, and then quietly disappeared into normal life. There was no spectacle, no ongoing phenomenon, no effort to preserve the mystery. The villagers moved on. History recorded it and then let it rest. The Green Children of Woolpit remain suspended between explanation and uncertainty. They may have been refugees, victims of disease, or something stranger shaped by misunderstanding. What we know is that they were real enough to be recorded, strange enough to be remembered, and ordinary enough to fade into the background of history once the immediate mystery passed. Their story reminds us that not every mystery announces itself loudly. Some arrive briefly, confuse everyone involved, and then dissolve into everyday life, leaving behind a question that no one at the time felt capable of answering. And sometimes, history preserves that question, not because it was important, but because it was never resolved. Rupkund Skeleton Lake. High in the Indian Himalayas, at an altitude of more than 5,000 meters, there's a small glacial lake that remains frozen for most of the year. For much of its existence, it was unknown beyond local shepherds and pilgrims who passed through the region briefly during the summer months. When the ice melts for a short window each year, however, the lake reveals something deeply unsettling. Hundreds of human skeletons lie scattered along its shores and beneath its shallow waters, exposed as if time paused at the moment of death and never fully resumed. This place is known as Rupkund, often called Skeleton Lake, and it presents one of the most unusual mass death events ever documented in a high-altitude environment. The bodies were not buried, they were not arranged. They were left where they fell, preserved by cold, altitude, and isolation. For decades, no one could explain who these people were, why they were here, or how so many died in the same remote location. When British forest rangers first reported the skeletons during World War II, initial assumptions reflected the anxieties of the time. Some speculated that the remains belonged to Japanese soldiers attempting to cross the Himalayas. That theory collapsed quickly once the age of the bones was examined. These deaths did not belong to modern warfare, they belonged to a much older past. As scientific investigation progressed, the mystery only deepened. The skeletons did not belong to a single group or a single moment in history. Radiocarbon dating revealed that people died at Rupkund during multiple periods, separated by centuries. Some individuals dated back to around the 9th century, while others were far more recent, possibly medieval or early modern. This immediately ruled out a single disaster involving one expedition. The physical condition of the bones added another layer of complexity. Many skulls showed signs of blunt force trauma, particularly circular fractures at the top of the head. These injuries were remarkably consistent across multiple individuals. At the same time, the rest of the skeleton showed little evidence of defensive wounds, weapon injuries, or interpersonal violence. This pattern was difficult to reconcile. The injuries did not resemble battle. They did not resemble execution. They did not resemble animal attack. Whatever caused these deaths acted from above, struck multiple people in similar ways, and left little damage elsewhere on the body. For years, speculation filled the gap. Some proposed landslides or avalanches, but these typically cause widespread skeletal damage, not focused cranial injuries. Others suggested disease, but disease does not fracture skulls. Still others suggested ritual sacrifice, but there is no cultural precedent that matches the evidence. Gradually, a more plausible explanation emerged, one that aligned with both the injuries and the environment. At extreme altitudes, weather conditions can change with terrifying speed. The Rupkan region lies along ancient pilgrimage routes, and historical records describe large groups traveling through the Himalayas for religious festivals. If such a group were caught in a sudden and violent hailstorm, with hailstones large enough to cause fatal head injuries, the results would be devastating. Unprotected heads struck repeatedly by falling ice could suffer exactly the kind of trauma observed on the skeletons. This explanation gained strength when local folklore was considered. Regional legends speak of a divine punishment, a storm of iron-like hail sent upon a group that violated sacred space. While the language is symbolic, the underlying memory of a deadly storm appears consistent with the physical evidence. Yet even this explanation does not fully resolve the mystery. DNA analysis revealed that the individuals at Rupkund were not all from the same genetic background. Some were local to South Asia. Others had genetic markers linked to populations from the Eastern Mediterranean. This suggests that the lake witnessed deaths from multiple groups, possibly traveling together or passing through at different times. Why would people from distant regions converge on such a remote and dangerous place? One possibility is pilgrimage. Religious journeys often draw participants from wide geographic areas. Another is trade or migration. The Himalayas, though hostile, have long served as corridors rather than barriers. The presence of women and individuals of varying ages among the dead further complicates any simple explanation. This was not a military expedition. It was not a specialized group prepared for extreme survival. Many were likely unprotected, ill-equipped, and unaware of the risks posed by sudden high-altitude storms. Once death occurred, recovery was impossible. At that altitude, rescue would have been unthinkable. Bodies would have remained where they fell, gradually preserved by cold and ice. Over centuries, seasonal melting would reveal them briefly, then conceal them again, turning the lake into a repeating archive of death. What makes Rupkund especially disturbing is the lack of closure. These people were never buried. Their remains were never gathered. Their identities were never recorded. They exist only as bones and fragments of story. Modern science has provided pieces of explanation, but not a full narrative. We know how they might have died. We do not know why they were there in such numbers, across such long spans of time, repeating the same fatal mistake. Rupkund challenges the idea that mystery requires advanced technology or lost civilizations. Sometimes mystery is simply the result of geography, belief, and human movement intersecting in a place where survival margins are thin. From a human perspective, Skeleton Lake is not frightening because of superstition, but because of vulnerability. It shows how ordinary people, following tradition or necessity, can be overtaken by forces they cannot predict or escape. The lake does not conceal its dead. It reveals them slowly. As this chapter closes, Rupkund remains a reminder that history is not always written by survivors. Some events leave no witnesses, no records, and no explanations beyond what the land itself preserves. The mountains do not explain. They endure. The Phaistos Dies Code. In 1908, during excavations at the Minoan Palace complex of Phaistos on the island of Crete, an object was uncovered that immediately defied classification. It was not a statue, not a tool, not a tablet filled with familiar writing. Instead, it was a small clay disc, carefully made, deliberately fired, and covered on both sides with symbols arranged in a precise spiral pattern. From the moment it was discovered, the Phaistos disc created a problem that has never been resolved, because everything about it suggests intentional communication, yet nothing about it fits into any known system of writing. The disc dates to approximately the 2nd millennium BCE, placing it within the Minoan civilization, one of the most advanced cultures of Bronze Age Europe. The Minoans built complex palaces, maintained far-reaching trade networks, and use multiple writing systems, including Linear A, which itself remains undeciphered, and yet the symbols on the Phaistos disk do not match Linear A, Linear B, or any other known script from the ancient Mediterranean. This is the first point of tension. Civilizations rarely invent completely isolated writing systems for single-use objects. Writing usually develops gradually, leaves traces, and appears across multiple media. The Phaistos disk stands alone. No other object like it has ever been found. No fragments, no practice pieces, no variations. Just one disk, complete and unique. The symbols themselves are not carved by hand. They appear to have been stamped into the clay using pre-made seals. This makes the disk even more unusual, because it implies the use of movable type more than 3,000 years before such technology was supposed to exist. Each symbol appears multiple times, identical in shape and size, suggesting that a standardized set of stamps was used. This was not improvised. There are 45 distinct symbols on the disk, including human figures, animals, tools, plants, and abstract shapes. They are arranged in a spiral that begins at the edge and moves inward, separated into individual units by vertical lines, as if marking words or phrases. This structure strongly resembles written language rather than decoration, yet no one can read it. Over the past century, linguists, archaeologists, cryptographers, and amateurs have proposed hundreds of interpretations. Some believe the disk contains a hymn, others a prayer, others a calendar, a legal document, a game board, or even a magical incantation. Some claim it represents a lost Indo-European language, others a Semitic one, and others something entirely isolated. None of these interpretations has achieved consensus. One reason is that decipherment requires comparison. Linear B was decoded because it appeared across thousands of tablets. The Rosetta Stone worked because it contained the same text in multiple scripts. The Phaistos disk offers no parallel material. It speaks once and never again. This makes it effectively mute. Another complication is authenticity. Shortly after its discovery, some scholars questioned whether the disk could be a hoax. This suspicion arose not because of evidence of fraud, but because the disk was too unique, too clean, too isolated. However, detailed analysis of the clay, firing method, and excavation context strongly supports its authenticity. There's no convincing evidence it was planted or fabricated in modern times. The disk is real. Its meaning is not. If the disk is genuine, then its uniqueness becomes the mystery itself. Why create a stamped, spiral text and then never repeat the method? One possibility is that the disk represents a ceremonial or symbolic object, rather than everyday writing. If so, it may not have been intended to be read widely or preserved beyond a specific ritual context. Another possibility is that the disk comes from a cultural interaction we barely understand. The Minoans traded extensively with Egypt, Anatolia, and the Levant. The disk may represent a hybrid system or a foreign message brought to Crete and copied locally. If the originating culture left no other records, the script would vanish with it. There's also the uncomfortable possibility that the disk represents an experiment that failed. Writing systems are not guaranteed to survive. Some are tried, abandoned, and forgotten. If the Phaistos disk was part of such an experiment, it may be the only surviving trace. What makes the disk especially frustrating is how close it feels to meaning. The symbols are clear, the repetition patterns suggest grammar, the structure suggests intentional order. This is not random. It is organized communication. But organization alone does not equal understanding. Modern computational analysis has been applied to the disk, attempting to identify statistical patterns that might indicate linguistic structure. These studies suggest that the disk behaves more like real language than random symbol arrangement. Yet this still does not reveal what language it is or what it says. The disk sits at the intersection of literacy and silence. From a human perspective, the Phaistos disk is unsettling because it reminds us that communication can fail across time even when it is physically preserved. The people who made this object likely believed it would be understood. They may have assumed the language would continue. They were wrong. The disk survived. The context did not. This raises a broader question about how much ancient communication has been lost, not through destruction but through isolation. Writing does not survive alone. It requires a community that continues to read it. When that chain breaks, meaning collapses, the Phaistos disk does not resist translation because it is mystical or coded beyond comprehension. It resists translation because it has no living relatives. It is an orphaned message. Standing in a museum today, the disc does not feel dramatic. It is small, quiet, and unassuming. And yet, it represents one of the clearest examples of how fragile human meaning truly is. We often imagine knowledge as permanent once written. The disc proves otherwise. As this chapter closes, the Phaistos disc remains exactly what it has always been. A message carefully crafted, deliberately preserved by chance, and completely detached from the world that gave it meaning. It does not reveal secrets. It reveals absence. Whatever was meant to be said was said once. Whatever was meant to be understood was understood then. And now, all that remains is the shape of language, preserved in clay, waiting for a reader that may never exist again. Utsuro Bune, the encounter that history could not classify. In the early 19th century, during a period when Japan was largely closed to the outside world, a story began circulating along its eastern coastline that did not fit comfortably within known categories of shipwrecks, foreign contact, or traditional folklore. It was recorded not once, but multiple times by different writers in different regions, each preserving roughly the same core details. The story came to be known as Utsuro Bune, which translates roughly to hollow boat, and it described an encounter so unusual that even the people who witnessed it struggled to decide what they were seeing. According to historical accounts dated around 1803, fishermen along the Hitachi province coast discovered a strange vessel drifting near shore. The object was unlike Japanese boats of the time, and did not resemble any foreign ship known to local authorities. It was described as round or oval in shape, with a lower half reinforced by metal plates, and an upper half enclosed by curved panels, some said to be made of glass or crystal-like material. The construction appeared deliberate, sealed, and unfamiliar. This alone would have been enough to attract attention in an era defined by strict isolation. Inside the vessel, the fishermen reportedly found a young woman who did not speak Japanese and could not communicate verbally. She was described as having unusual clothing, pale skin, and striking features that did not clearly match local populations. She carried with her a small box that she refused to part with under any circumstances. Attempts to open it or take it from her were reportedly resisted. Along the inner walls of the vessel were strange markings, symbols that did not resemble Japanese writing, Chinese characters, or any known script at the time. These symbols were recorded in drawings that survive in historical manuscripts, adding a layer of documentation that makes the story difficult to dismiss as pure invention. The fishermen brought the woman and the vessel to local officials, who faced an immediate problem. Japan's isolation policy strictly controlled contact with foreigners. Foreign ships were to be turned away. Foreign individuals were not to be sheltered. The officials, uncertain of the woman's origin and unable to communicate with her, made a decision that appears repeatedly in the records. The vessel was returned to the sea, and the woman was sent away inside it. The story ends not with explanation, but with removal. What makes the Utsurobune account particularly interesting is not how extraordinary it sounds today, but how it was treated at the time. The original records do not frame the event as supernatural. They don't describe gods, spirits, or omens. They describe confusion, uncertainty, and administrative response. The tone is observational rather than sensational. This suggests the writers believed something unusual had occurred, even if they did not know what it was. Several historical texts from the Edo period include illustrations of the vessel and the symbols inside it. While these images vary slightly, the overall structure remains consistent across sources. This consistency is important because it implies that later writers were copying from earlier accounts rather than inventing details freely. The question then becomes one of classification. Some historians interpret the Utsurobune as a misunderstood foreign vessel, possibly Russian or European in origin. Japan's knowledge of Western ship design at the time was limited, and unusual materials or shapes could have seemed alien. The woman may have been a castaway, her language unfamiliar, her appearance unusual to local observers. This explanation is plausible, but incomplete. No known European vessel from the early 19th century matches the described shape precisely. The sealed construction, round form, and interior markings do not align neatly with contemporary shipbuilding traditions. The metal reinforcement described is also unusual for small boats of that era. Another interpretation views the story as folklore. a symbolic narrative reflecting cultural anxiety about outsiders during a time of enforced isolation. The mysterious woman becomes a narrative device, embodying the unknown world beyond Japan's borders. The sealed box she carries becomes a symbol of forbidden knowledge. This interpretation explains the persistence of the story, but it does not fully explain the technical details recorded in multiple accounts. In the modern era, some have taken the story much further, interpreting it as an early account of extraterrestrial contact. This interpretation is shaped heavily by contemporary ideas and should be approached with caution. The historical texts themselves do not describe the woman as non-human, nor do they suggest the vessel came from the sky or behaved in ways that defy physical reality. What they describe is unfamiliar, not impossible. From a serious historical perspective, the value of the Utsurobune story lies not in proving extraordinary claims, but in showing how societies respond to encounters that do not fit existing categories. The fishermen did not know what they had found. The officials did not know how to classify it. The solution was not investigation, but removal. This response is revealing. In a closed society, uncertainty itself can be dangerous. When classification fails, containment becomes the safest option. Sending the vessel back to sea avoided political risk, cultural disruption, and responsibility. The woman's fate remains unknown. The records do not say where the vessel went, whether it sank, or whether it reached another shore. The story ends exactly where control ends, at the waterline. From a human perspective, the Utsurobune account is unsettling, not because it implies something otherworldly, but because it highlights how fragile understanding can be. An event can be carefully observed, recorded, and yet still remain unexplained because the tools needed to interpret it do not exist. Language failed, context failed, and so the event passed unresolved. Over time, the story transformed. What was once a confusing encounter became folklore. What was once administrative uncertainty became mystery. And in the modern imagination, mystery often drifts towards the extraordinary. But stripped of later interpretation, Utsurobune remains a historical account of an encounter that did not fit the world as it was understood at the time. It challenges the assumption that history always records clarity. Sometimes it records confusion honestly and leaves it there. As this chapter closes, the hollow boat drifts not just on the sea, but through history itself, carrying with it a woman whose name was never recorded, a box whose contents were never known, and a story that resisted explanation from the moment it occurred. The encounter was real to those who witnessed it. The meaning was not, and that gap between experience and understanding is where the mystery of Utsurobune still lives. The Shroud of Turin Enigma. In a cathedral in the city of Turin, Italy, there's a long linen cloth that has generated more scientific studies, religious debate, and public fascination than almost any other object in history. It's known as the Shroud of Turin, and it bears the faint but detailed image of a man who appears to have been crucified, showing wounds consistent with Roman execution practices described in ancient texts. For centuries, this cloth has existed at the boundary between faith and science, never fully claimed by either, and never fully dismissed by both. The shroud is approximately 4 meters long and just over 1 meter wide, woven in a simple but unusual herringbone pattern. On its surface appears a front and back image of a human figure, as if the cloth had been laid over a body and then folded lengthwise. The image is not painted in any conventional sense. There are no brushstrokes, no pigments binding the image to the fibers, and no clear explanation for how the image was formed. This absence of obvious technique is the core of the mystery. Historically, the shroud first appears with certainty in the mid-14th century in France, though some argue it may have existed earlier under different names. From that point onward, it became an object of veneration, believed by many to be the burial cloth of Jesus of Nazareth. The Catholic Church has never officially declared it authentic or fraudulent, instead allowing it to exist as an object of contemplation rather than doctrine. Scientific scrutiny began in earnest in the 20th century. In 1978, an international team of scientists known as the Shroud of Turin Research Project conducted extensive physical and chemical tests. They examined the image formation, the blood stains, the fibers, and the weave. Their findings complicated the debate rather than resolving it. The image appears to be superficial, affecting only the topmost fibers of the cloth. It does not penetrate deeply, which would be expected if paint or dye had been used. The coloration is consistent with oxidation and dehydration of the linen fibers, but the mechanism that caused this effect remains unclear. Heat, light, chemical reactions, and artistic techniques have all been proposed, but none fully replicate the observed properties. The bloodstains add another layer of complexity. Chemical tests indicate the presence of hemoglobin, and the blood appears to have been applied before the image was formed, not after. The wounds visible on the figure correspond closely with what is known about Roman crucifixion, including marks on the wrists rather than the palms, a detail often overlooked in medieval art, but consistent with historical execution methods. At the same time, the shroud presents anatomical oddities. The body proportions appear elongated. The hair seems to fall in a way that does not fully align with gravity if the body were lying flat. The image itself behaves strangely under photographic analysis. When photographed and converted into a photographic negative, the image appears more lifelike and detailed, as if the cloth itself contains negative information. This discovery, made in the late 19th century, transformed the debate. A medieval forgery would have had to encode photographic properties centuries before photography existed. Skeptics point to radiocarbon dating performed in 1988, which dated samples of the cloth to the medieval period, roughly between 1260 and 1390 CE. This result strongly suggests the shroud was created during the time it first appeared in historical records. However, critics of the test argue that the sampled area may have come from a repaired section of the cloth, contaminated by later handling, fire damage, or environmental factors. Subsequent studies have suggested that the shroud may have been patched or rewoven in the Middle Ages, complicating the reliability of the dating. The debate over the carbon dating has never fully settled, not because the method is flawed, but because the sample's representativeness remains contested. What makes the Shroud of Turin endure is not that it proves or disproves a religious claim, but that it resists classification. If it is a forgery, it is unlike any other known forgery. If it is authentic, it challenges current understanding of image formation processes. There is also the cultural dimension. Medieval Europe produced many religious relics, some genuine, many not. The Shroud of Turin does not behave like typical devotional art. It lacks embellishment. It lacks symbolism. It presents a raw, almost clinical depiction of suffering rather than glorification. This is unusual for its supposed time. From a human perspective, the shroud is compelling because it sits in a space where belief and doubt coexist without resolution. Those who approach it through faith see confirmation. Those who approach it through science see unresolved anomalies. Both groups agree on one thing: the image is real, and its formation is not easily explained. The shroud does not demand belief. It does not demand skepticism. It simply exists, unchanged, while interpretation shifts around it. Modern technology continues to analyze the cloth with increasing precision, yet each advance answers some questions while raising others. Microscopy, spectroscopy, and digital imaging have refined understanding of the fibers and the image, but they have not produced a definitive mechanism. This leaves the Shroud of Turin in a rare position. It is not a solved problem, and it is not an unsolved myth. It is an object whose ambiguity is its defining feature. The shroud remains folded away most of the time, displayed only on rare occasions, not because it is fragile, but because its power lies in restraint. It is not an artifact that reveals itself fully under scrutiny. It reveals the limits of certainty, whether one sees it as a sacred relic, an extraordinary medieval creation, or something still unexplained. The Shroud of Turin continues to occupy a space where history, science, and belief intersect without resolution. And perhaps that unresolved space is precisely why the enigma endures. The Pollock Sisters' Reincarnation Mystery. Memory, grief, and a case that refused to fade. In the early 1950s, in a small English town, a family tragedy unfolded that would later become one of the most debated cases in the study of reincarnation claims. It did not begin as a mystery, but as a loss. Two young sisters, Joanna and Jacqueline Pollock, were killed in a road accident while walking to church. The event devastated their parents, John and Florence Pollock, and left their home marked by grief that would shape everything that followed. For months after the accident, the Pollock family lived with the absence. Toys remained unused. Rooms stayed quiet. The future the parents had imagined for their daughters was abruptly erased. John Pollock, who held strong religious beliefs, struggled deeply with the idea that his daughters were gone forever. Florence, more cautious and grounded, focused on survival rather than belief. At this point, nothing about the situation suggested it would become anything more than a private tragedy. About a year later, Florence became pregnant and gave birth to twin girls, Jillian and Jennifer. The birth itself was unexpected, as there was no known history of twins in the family. From the beginning, John Pollock became convinced that his daughters had returned. Florence rejected this idea outright, viewing it as a coping mechanism rather than reality. The mystery did not begin with belief. It began with behavior. As the twins grew old enough to speak, they began to exhibit patterns that disturbed their parents, particularly Florence, who had resisted any suggestion of reincarnation. The girls began asking for toys that had belonged to Joanna and Jacqueline, toys they had never seen and had never been mentioned to them. When these toys were brought out, stored away since the accident, the twins reportedly identified them accurately and assigned them to the correct former owner without prompting. More unsettling were the details the children recalled. They spoke about events, locations, and experiences that matched the lives of the deceased sisters, including specific games played, injuries sustained, and daily routines. Jennifer, one of the twins, displayed a birthmark on her forehead that closely matched a scar Jacqueline had received shortly before her death. Another mark appeared on her waist, corresponding to an injury Jacqueline had suffered in the accident. Birthmarks are common. Correspondence is not proof, but coincidence begins to feel uncomfortable when it repeats. The strongest evidence came from behavior rather than statements. When the family returned to their former town after several years away, the twins reportedly recognized landmarks they had never visited, including the road where the accident occurred. They expressed fear at that location without being told why it mattered. Jennifer in particular showed distress when cars approached quickly, behavior that mirrored Jacqueline's documented anxiety before her death. Importantly, many of these observations were made by Florence, who had no interest in reinforcing a reincarnation narrative. She documented her doubts carefully and often challenged her husband's interpretations. This resistance lends weight to the case, not because it proves reincarnation, but because the observations were not driven by belief alone. Psychologists and researchers later examined the Pollock case with mixed conclusions. Some argued that subtle cues, parental influence, and family dynamics could explain the behavior. Children are sensitive to emotional environments, especially in households shaped by grief. Memory can be shaped unconsciously, and suggestion doesn't always require direct instruction. Others noted that some of the twins' statements and behaviors appeared before the family returned to familiar locations or reintroduced objects from the past. This makes simple environmental explanation less satisfying, though not impossible. What complicates the case further is what happened next. As the twins grew older, the behaviors and memories associated with the deceased sisters gradually faded. By the age of 5 or 6, the girls no longer spoke about past lives, no longer showed unusual recognition, and began developing identities clearly distinct from Joanna and Jacqueline. This pattern is consistent with many reported reincarnation cases, where claimed memories disappear as childhood progresses. This raises an important question. If the behaviors were learned, why did they stop without intervention? If they were imagined, why were they so specific early on and then vanish? The Pollock case sits in an uncomfortable middle space. It does not offer definitive proof of reincarnation. It does not collapse easily into fabrication or fantasy either. It exists primarily because it was documented carefully, debated openly, and never exaggerated into spectacle by the family involved. John Pollock never claimed certainty. Florence Pollock never accepted belief. Between them, the case remained grounded rather than sensational. From a human perspective, this is what makes the story endure. It is not about proving an afterlife. It is about how grief, memory, identity, and childhood consciousness interact in ways we do not fully understand. The twins were not treated as curiosities. They were raised as individuals, and when the unusual behaviors ended, the family did not try to preserve them. Life continued. Modern psychology offers explanations involving cryptomnesia, where forgotten information resurfaces without conscious awareness, and emotional imprinting, where children absorb unspoken narratives from their environment. These explanations are plausible, but they do not account for every reported detail cleanly. At the same time, reincarnation research remains controversial, largely because it challenges foundational assumptions about identity and memory. The Pollock case is often cited, not because it proves anything, but because it was observed in real time, by skeptical witnesses, without financial incentive or media manipulation. The case leaves us with unresolved questions rather than conclusions. Were the twins expressing inherited trauma rather than memory? Did grief create a narrative that shaped perception on both sides? Or did something occur that current models of consciousness cannot fully explain? The Pollock sisters' mystery does not ask us to believe. It asks us to consider how little we understand about memory formation in early childhood, and how deeply loss can echo through families in ways that appear external but may be internal. As this chapter closes, the twins themselves remain ordinary adults, living lives unconnected to the story that once surrounded them. The mystery did not define them. It simply passed through their earliest years and then faded. What remains is not an answer, but a reminder. Some mysteries persist not because they are dramatic, but because they sit exactly at the point where explanation becomes uncomfortable, neither clearly false nor convincingly proven, and deeply human in their origin. And it is often in that quiet space that the hardest questions remain. The Plain of Jars Enigma. Across a series of high plateaus in northern Laos, there's a landscape that immediately feels out of place, not because it is dramatic or hidden, but because it is quiet and exposed, scattered with thousands of massive stone jars resting in the open, as if deliberately placed and then forgotten. This region is known as the Plain of Jars, and despite decades of archaeological study, no single explanation has fully resolved why these objects were made, how they were used, or what kind of society had the capacity and motivation to create them. The jars themselves are carved from solid stone, primarily sandstone and limestone, and range widely in size. Some stand only a meter tall, while others reach nearly 3 meters in height and weigh several tons. Most are cylindrical with wide openings at the top, though their shapes are not perfectly uniform. Some have rims, some do not. Some appear roughly finished, while others are carefully shaped. They are spread across dozens of sites, often positioned on hills, ridges, and open plains, rather than hidden or protected locations. This immediately raises questions about intent. If the jars were meant to store food or water, their placement makes little sense. The open terrain offers no protection from animals or weather. The sheer weight of the jars makes regular use impractical. If they were meant to be hidden, they were placed in the wrong locations. If they were meant to be defensive, they lack any strategic alignment. Early interpretations struggled to place the jars into familiar categories. Local legends offered one explanation. According to traditional stories, the jars were created by giants who used them to brew rice wine after a great victory. While clearly symbolic, these stories reflect how long the jars have existed in the cultural memory of the region. They were already ancient when the legends formed. Archaeological evidence suggests the jars date back to the Iron Age, roughly between 500 BCE and 500 CE. This places their creation well before modern populations settled the area. The people who made them left no written records, no clear settlements nearby, and no obvious cultural markers that link them to known civilizations in the region. What has been found near some jars are human remains. Burial pits, bones, and grave goods such as beads and tools suggest a funerary context. This has led many researchers to propose that the jars were part of complex burial practices, possibly used to expose bodies or store remains before final interment. This explanation fits some of the evidence, but not all. Not all jars are associated with burials. Some sites show clear funerary activity, while others do not. The scale of the jars also varies significantly, and it is unclear why different individuals or groups would require containers of such different sizes. There is also little consensus on how the jars were actually used in the burial process. Were bodies placed inside? Were bones stored? Were the jars symbolic rather than functional? Adding to the mystery is the question of construction. Quarry sites have been identified where jars appear to have been carved directly from stone outcrops, but many jars are located kilometers away from any known quarry. Transporting multi-ton stone objects across uneven terrain without modern machinery would have required significant labor and planning, yet there is little evidence of permanent settlements large enough to support such activity. This suggests that the society responsible for the jars may have been highly mobile, organizing large communal efforts for specific purposes rather than maintaining centralized cities. If so, the jars may represent gathering points, ritual markers, or territorial symbols, rather than everyday tools. Another complication is the lack of uniform orientation. The jars do not consistently face the same direction. They are not aligned with astronomical events in any obvious way. This absence of pattern challenges theories that rely on cosmological or calendrical function. The jars simply exist where they are. Modern archaeology has also been limited by circumstance. Large areas of the Plain of Jars were heavily bombed during the 20th century, leaving unexploded ordnance scattered throughout the region. This has made excavation dangerous and slow. Many sites remain inaccessible, meaning that the full scope of the jar network is still unknown. What we see today may only be a fraction of what once existed. From a human perspective, the Plain of Jars is unsettling because it represents effort without explanation. Someone invested enormous time and energy into carving and placing these objects, not in secret but in plain view, and then disappeared without leaving instructions, stories, or context that survived. There's no clear moment of collapse associated with the jars, no evidence of destruction, no sign that the practice ended abruptly. It simply stopped. The jars were not dismantled. They were not reused. They were left exactly where they stood. This suggests that whatever belief system or social structure gave them meaning no longer existed, and without that structure, the jars became mute. Stone endures longer than purpose. The Plain of Jars challenges the assumption that ancient monuments must be monumental in intent. These jars do not glorify rulers, commemorate battles, or mark cities. They appear communal, repetitive, and anonymous. Their power lies in accumulation rather than individuality. The jars remain scattered across the landscape, exposed to weather, vegetation, and time, still unguarded, still unexplained. They don't invite awe through scale alone, but through persistence. They refuse to be ignored because they do not explain themselves. The people who made them are gone. The reason they mattered is gone. What remains is stone shaped by intention and abandoned without explanation, reminding us that human effort does not always leave behind understanding, and that some of the most enduring traces of the past are also the least willing to speak. Greek fire, the ancient weapon that should not have worked. In the history of warfare, few weapons have inspired the same mixture of fear, confusion, and frustration as Greek fire. It was not just effective, it was overwhelming. It burned on water, clung to ships, ignored rain, and spread panic through enemy fleets long before they ever reached the walls of Constantinople. For centuries, it protected the Byzantine Empire from destruction, and when the empire finally fell, the knowledge of how to make it disappeared almost completely. Greek fire first appeared in historical records in the 7th century, at a moment when the Byzantine Empire was under extreme pressure. Arab naval forces were expanding rapidly, and Constantinople, the most important city in the eastern Mediterranean, faced repeated sieges. Traditional defenses were not enough. Something new entered the battlefield, and its effect was immediate. Contemporary accounts describe a liquid substance projected from siphons mounted on ships, igniting on contact and continuing to burn even as it spread across the surface of the sea. Enemy sailors could not extinguish it with water. Attempts to smother it often failed. Panic spread faster than the fire itself, and entire fleets were destroyed without close combat. What made Greek fire so terrifying was not just its destructive power, but its unpredictability. It behaved unlike any known weapon. Water, the natural enemy of fire, became useless. This inverted one of the oldest assumptions of combat at sea. Byzantine sources guarded the secret fiercely. The formula was known only to a small group of specialists, passed down through controlled channels, and never written down in a complete form. Foreign observers were denied access. Even allied states were kept in ignorance. The weapon became less a technology and more a state's secret embedded in ritual, control, and loyalty. This secrecy was deliberate. Descriptions of Greek fire vary across sources, but none provide enough detail to allow confident reconstruction. Some mention sulfur, others naphtha, quicklime, resin, or petroleum-based substances. Modern researchers believe Greek fire was likely a complex mixture, rather than a single ingredient, engineered to ignite under specific conditions, and delivered through pressurized systems that themselves required advanced understanding of mechanics. The delivery method is as important as the substance itself. The Byzantines used bronze siphons, possibly heated, to project the fire in controlled streams. This required coordination, training, and specialized equipment, not just a flammable mixture. Without the system, the formula alone would have been useless. This raises a critical point. Greek fire was not just a chemical invention, it was an integrated weapon system. Several later civilizations attempted to recreate it. Islamic states developed incendiary weapons inspired by Byzantine descriptions. Medieval Europe experimented with fire-based projectiles. China independently developed gunpowder-based fire weapons. None of these fully replicated the properties attributed to Greek fire. The reason may lie in intentional loss. When the Byzantine Empire declined, the tightly controlled institutional structure that protected the secret collapsed. Specialists died, workshops were destroyed, knowledge that existed only through oral transmission vanished. There was no manual to recover. The formula did not survive because it was never allowed to exist independently of the state. This was not accidental ignorance. It was strategic erasure. Greek fire challenges the assumption that technological progress is linear and cumulative. Here's a weapon that worked extraordinarily well, whose existence is well documented, and yet whose method was not preserved. This runs counter to the modern belief that effective technology inevitably spreads. In this case, effectiveness increased secrecy. From a human perspective, Greek fire represents a different relationship between knowledge and power. The Byzantines understood that some knowledge was too dangerous to circulate freely. They treated the formula not as property, but as responsibility. Its disappearance was the final consequence of a system built on containment. Modern chemistry can produce substances with similar properties. Napalm, thermite, and other incendiaries share certain behaviors. But these are analogs, not reconstructions. We still don't know exactly what Greek fire was, how stable it was, or how it was safely stored and deployed on wooden ships without catastrophic accidents. This gap remains frustrating precisely because the weapon clearly existed. Greek fire is not myth. It is not legend. It is documented fact with missing instructions. Its use shaped history. It saved Constantinople multiple times. It altered naval warfare. It delayed the fall of an empire. And then it vanished, leaving behind fear, speculation, and partial descriptions that never quite add up. As this chapter closes, Greek fire stands as a reminder that knowledge does not always survive success. Sometimes it's destroyed by the very systems that protect it. Sometimes it's lost because it was never meant to outlive the circumstances that required it. The weapon burned ships. The secret burned itself out. What remains is an outline of power without a recipe. A warning written not in flame, but in absence, showing that even the most effective technologies can disappear when secrecy becomes more important than memory.
The Steppe Geoglyphs Puzzle. Across the vast grasslands of northern Kazakhstan, far from major cities and largely invisible at ground level, there are enormous geometric shapes etched into the earth that went unnoticed for centuries. They do not rise as monuments. They do not form walls or buildings. Instead, they exist as patterns, visible only from above, spread across open steppe in a region where few people had reason to look at the land from the sky. These structures are known today as the steppe geoglyphs, and their discovery raised questions that modern archaeology still struggles to answer. The geoglyphs were first identified in the early 21st century through satellite imagery. What appeared on screens were massive shapes measuring hundreds of meters across, including squares, crosses, rings, and lines, arranged with clear intentionality. Some formations consist of dozens of raised mounds connected by straight paths, while others form simple but precise geometric outlines that make little sense when viewed from ground level. This immediately presents a problem of purpose. The people who built these structures could not have seen them from above. There were no aircraft, no balloons, no vantage points high enough to reveal the full shapes. Whatever meaning the geoglyphs held, it was not meant for everyday visual appreciation. Dating the structures adds further complexity. Archaeological evidence suggests they were constructed by cultures associated with the Turgai region, possibly as early as 8,000 years ago, though exact dating remains difficult due to limited organic material. If this timeline is correct, the geoglyphs predate many well-known monumental traditions and belong to societies that are otherwise poorly understood. These were not settled agricultural civilizations with cities and writing. They were likely semi-nomadic steppe peoples whose material culture was light, mobile, and largely perishable. And yet, they invested enormous labor into reshaping the landscape itself. The scale of effort is significant. Constructing these shapes required moving earth and stone over large distances, coordinating groups of people, and maintaining consistent geometry across open terrain. This was not casual activity. It required planning, shared purpose, and continuity across time. What remains unclear is why. Some researchers have suggested the geoglyphs served ceremonial or ritual functions, possibly connected to seasonal gatherings, ancestral memory, or territorial identity. In open steppe environments where landmarks are scarce, large-scale earthworks could serve as markers of presence and belonging, readable not visually, but symbolically by those who knew their meaning. Others propose astronomical functions. Certain shapes may align with cardinal directions, solstices, or seasonal movement patterns. However, evidence for precise astronomical alignment remains inconclusive, and the diversity of shapes complicates a single explanatory model. Unlike stone circles or temples, the steppe geoglyphs do not cluster tightly around one central function. They vary in form and distribution, suggesting multiple purposes or evolving traditions rather than a unified design. Another interpretation views them as expressions of social organization. Creating something that could not be easily altered or moved may have been a way to anchor identity in a landscape otherwise defined by movement. For mobile societies, permanent marks on the land could serve as memory devices, linking people to place across generations. This idea challenges common assumptions about monumentality. We often associate large-scale construction with sedentary societies, yet the steppe geoglyphs suggest that mobility and monument building are not mutually exclusive. Modern technology has helped identify and map these structures, but it has not solved the puzzle. Ground surveys reveal limited associated artifacts. There are no nearby settlements that clearly explain sustained occupation. The geoglyphs exist largely on their own, detached from daily life as archaeologists usually understand it. This isolation is unsettling. The structures were not hidden, they were not protected. They were left exposed to erosion, weather, and time. This suggests that their meaning did not depend on constant maintenance or visual clarity. Even partially degraded, they continued to exist as concepts embedded in the land. From a human perspective, the most difficult aspect of the steppe geoglyphs is accepting that their primary audience may not have been human at all, at least not in the conventional sense. The scale suggests they were designed to be understood from a perspective larger than the individual, perhaps symbolically addressing the sky, the spirits, or a cosmological order rather than observers on the ground. This does not imply advanced technology or lost science. It implies symbolic thinking unconstrained by practicality. Humans have always created meaning that exceeds immediate utility. The geoglyphs also remind us how much of ancient human expression remains invisible until technology reveals it. For centuries, these shapes existed beneath the feet of travelers and herders, unnoticed because the angle of observation was wrong. Only when viewed from above did they emerge as deliberate patterns. This raises a broader question about how much else remains unrecognized simply because we are not looking from the right perspective. As this chapter closes, the steppe geoglyphs remain unresolved, not because evidence is lacking, but because intention cannot be reconstructed easily. We can map the shapes, measure the distances, and date the soil, but we cannot fully access the worldview that made such constructions meaningful. The people who made them left no explanation. The land kept the shapes. And between those two facts lies a silence that technology can expose, but not interpret. The Carnac Stones Alignment Puzzle. Along the western coast of France, near the small town of Carnac in Brittany, thousands of standing stones stretch across the landscape in long, deliberate lines. They do not form a single monument or enclosure. Instead, they extend for kilometers, arranged in parallel rows that rise and fall with the terrain, creating one of the largest and most complex stone alignments anywhere in the world. Despite centuries of observation, study, and speculation, no single explanation has convincingly resolved why these stones were erected, how they were organized, or what purpose they ultimately served. The Carnac stones are ancient, dating back to the Neolithic period, roughly between 4500 and 3300 BCE. This places their construction thousands of years before the Druids often associated with them in popular imagination, and well before written records in the region. The people who built them left no inscriptions, no clear settlements directly tied to the alignments, and no instructions that survived beyond the stones themselves. What remains is scale. More than 3,000 stones once stood at Carnac, though fewer remain upright today. Some are small, barely taller than a person. Others weigh several tons. They are arranged in distinct groupings, such as the Manek, Kermario, and Kurliskan alignments, each with its own structure and rhythm. The stones often increase in size toward one end of an alignment and decrease toward the other, a pattern that suggests deliberate planning rather than random placement. This consistency is difficult to ignore. If the stones were merely markers or memorials, their precise ordering raises questions. If they were symbolic, the repetition across vast distances implies a shared understanding maintained over generations. The labor required to quarry, transport, and erect thousands of stones would have demanded coordination, social organization, and long-term commitment from communities that were otherwise small and agrarian. Yet there is no obvious central monument tying the alignments together. Some researchers have proposed that the stones served astronomical purposes, aligned with solar or lunar events. While certain stones may correspond roughly to solstices or seasonal markers, the overall system does not align cleanly with known celestial cycles. Unlike Stonehenge, where alignments are precise and limited, Karnak is sprawling and inconsistent in orientation. This weakens purely astronomical explanations. Others have suggested ritual or ceremonial functions, possibly connected to ancestor worship, processions, or territorial boundaries. In this view, the stones formed a sacred landscape rather than a single structure, guiding movement and behavior rather than observation. The alignments could have been walked rather than watched. This interpretation fits better with the scale, but it still leaves unanswered why the stones are arranged so methodically and why their size changes across the lines. Another theory views the stones as markers of social order. The increasing and decreasing sizes may reflect hierarchy, progression, or stages of ritual significance. In societies without writing, large-scale spatial organization can serve as a way to encode meaning into the environment itself. The land becomes a memory structure. However, this explanation remains speculative. Excavations around some stones have revealed pits and packing stones, confirming that they were intentionally erected rather than natural formations. In a few areas, evidence of burial activity has been found nearby, though not consistently across all alignments. This suggests that the stones may have served multiple functions, or that their meaning evolved over time. One of the most frustrating aspects of Karnak is the absence of clear contextual clues. There are no nearby villages that explain sustained construction. There are no artifacts clearly associated with daily use. The stones stand largely alone, detached from ordinary life as archaeology usually reconstructs it. This isolation creates ambiguity. Modern mapping and surveying have shown that the alignments follow subtle variations in the landscape rather than ignoring them. The builders worked with the terrain rather than imposing rigid geometry upon it. This suggests sensitivity to place rather than abstract design. From a human perspective, the Karnak stones challenge the assumption that ancient people built monuments to be understood by outsiders or future generations. These alignments may have been meaningful only to those who participated in their creation and use. Once that cultural framework disappeared, the stones remained, but the logic connecting them was lost. The fact that the alignments were never dismantled is also significant. Later populations did not reuse the stones extensively for construction, even though they were convenient sources of material. This suggests a long-standing respect for the site, even when its original purpose was no longer understood. Respect can preserve mystery as effectively as neglect. Over time, folklore filled the gaps. Stories emerged of Roman soldiers turned to stone, of giants and saints, of supernatural forces that fixed the stones in place. These stories do not explain the alignments, but they reveal how deeply the site unsettled those who inherited it without context. The Karnak stones do not overwhelm through height or enclosure, they overwhelm through repetition. Standing among them, the eye follows line after line into the distance, searching for an endpoint or focal point that never quite arrives. The effect is disorienting rather than grand. This may be intentional. As this chapter closes, the Karnak stones remain one of the clearest examples of large-scale human effort without surviving explanation. The builders shaped the land with care and consistency, then vanished, leaving behind order without instruction. The stones do not tell us what to think. They do not tell us where to look. They simply continue to stand, aligned in silence, reminding us that meaning can be vast, deliberate, and yet completely inaccessible once the culture that created it is gone. The Disc of Sabu Mystery Artifact. In 1936, during excavations at the Saqqara necropolis in Egypt, archaeologists uncovered an object that immediately resisted classification. It was found in the tomb of Prince Sabu, a high-ranking official from Egypt's first dynasty, dating to around 3000 BCE. The tomb itself was consistent with its era, containing familiar funerary items made of stone and pottery. But one object stood apart from everything else. It did not resemble ritual equipment, jewelry, tools, or decoration known from early dynastic Egypt. It appeared functional, precise, and fundamentally out of place. This object is now known as the Disc of Sabu. The disc is made of schist, a brittle metamorphic stone that is difficult to carve cleanly, especially into thin, curved forms. It measures roughly 60 centimeters in diameter and consists of a flat central hub surrounded by 3 curved blades that extend outward in a symmetrical pattern. The entire form is remarkably thin, delicate, and balanced. It looks less like a ceremonial object and more like a mechanical component. This is the core of the mystery. Early dynastic Egypt is not known for complex rotary devices. Wheels were not in common use. Machines with moving parts had not yet appeared in the archaeological record. And yet, the Disc of Sabu appears designed to rotate, channel, or direct something, whether air, liquid, or force. Its shape is not decorative, it is engineered. Attempts to interpret the disc as a bowl, lamp, or ritual platter have largely failed. The thinness of the stone makes it impractical for holding weight or heat. The central hole suggests mounting or attachment rather than display. The curved blades are shaped as if to guide motion, not to be viewed symbolically. If the disc was symbolic, its symbolism does not match known Egyptian motifs from the period. One common suggestion is that the disc was a ceremonial imitation of a functional object made from perishable material, such as wood or metal. In this view, the schist version served as a symbolic replacement for something real, included in the tomb for ritual completeness. This explanation is reasonable, but it raises another question. If the original functional object existed, where is the rest of the system it belonged to? No similar objects have been found. There are no depictions of such devices in reliefs or paintings. No fragments of associated mechanisms have been identified. No textual references describe anything that resembles the disc's form or function. It exists in isolation. This isolation is what makes the Disc of Sabu so difficult to dismiss. Some researchers have proposed that it was part of a water-related device, perhaps used in irrigation, ritual libation, or fluid movement. The blades could have helped channel liquid outward from the center. Experimental reconstructions suggest that if mounted on a shaft and rotated, the disc could move fluid efficiently. But this hypothesis introduces a technological leap that is not supported elsewhere in the archaeological record of the time. Others have suggested it may have been a flywheel or component of a primitive mechanical system. Again, this interpretation clashes with everything else we know about First Dynasty technology. There is no evidence of systems that would require such a part. Skeptical interpretations emphasize caution. The disc could be an elaborate ritual object whose meaning is simply lost. Ancient societies often created complex forms for symbolic reasons that do not translate into modern functional logic. The assumption that it must be mechanical may say more about us than about them, and yet, even symbolic objects tend to follow cultural patterns. The Disc of Sabu does not. The craftsmanship required to produce it is also notable. Schist fractures easily, especially when carved thin. Producing smooth curves and consistent thickness without breaking the material would have required exceptional skill and careful planning. This suggests that the maker knew exactly what shape they were trying to achieve and why. Accidental form is unlikely. From a human perspective, the Disc of Sabu is unsettling because it sits precisely at the boundary between interpretation and speculation. It does not prove advanced lost technology. It does not fit comfortably into known ritual categories. It simply exists as a form that looks purposeful without explaining its purpose. Modern comparisons often exaggerate the mystery by likening it to propellers or turbines. These comparisons should be treated carefully. Similarity in shape does not equal similarity in function, but the persistence of such comparisons highlights an important point. The disk triggers mechanical intuition. We see function where function is not supposed to be. What cannot be ignored is that the disk was valued enough to be placed in a high-status tomb. It was not discarded. It was not broken intentionally. It was included deliberately, suggesting significance beyond decoration. That significance has not survived. As with many ancient objects, the disk of Sabu may represent a local innovation that never spread, a short-lived experiment, or a specialized tool used in a context we no longer recognize. Innovation does not always lead to continuity. Some ideas appear once and disappear without leaving descendants. History tends to preserve successes. Failures and dead ends vanish. As this chapter closes, the disk of Sabu remains suspended in uncertainty. It does not demand extraordinary explanations. It demands humility. It reminds us that ancient societies were capable of creativity that does not align neatly with our timelines or categories. The disk is real. The context is gone. And between those two facts lies a silence that archaeology cannot easily fill: the Devil's Footprints incident. On the morning of February 9, 1855, residents across parts of southern England stepped outside after a heavy snowfall and encountered something that did not fit any familiar pattern of animal behavior, weather effect, or human activity. Stretching across miles of countryside, villages, fields, rooftops, walls, and even over obstacles that should have broken any normal trail, a line of strange footprints appeared overnight. The marks were small, evenly spaced, and uncannily consistent, as if made by something walking upright and deliberately. Almost immediately, people began calling them the Devil's Footprints, not because of superstition alone, but because no ordinary explanation seemed to account for what they were seeing. The footprints were reported across Devon and surrounding counties, covering distances estimated at more than 100 miles. They crossed frozen rivers, climbed over haystacks, passed through enclosed gardens, and appeared on both sides of high walls and rooftops without interruption. In some cases, the tracks seemed to narrow as they moved across narrow surfaces and widen again on open ground, maintaining a rhythm and spacing that many witnesses described as unnatural. Each print was roughly 4 inches long and appeared cloven, resembling a small hoof. The spacing between prints was consistent, as if made by a creature walking rather than hopping, and there was no visible sign of dragging, slipping, or struggle. This regularity disturbed observers more than the shape itself. What made the incident particularly difficult to dismiss was the sheer number of independent reports. This was not a single village story passed along and embellished. Newspapers of the time recorded accounts from multiple locations, many separated by significant distances, all describing the same kind of tracks appearing during the same night. The reports were contemporary, detailed, and written in a period when printed media did not yet rely on sensationalism in the modern sense. People tried to explain what they saw using the knowledge available to them. Some suggested that the footprints belonged to an escaped animal, such as a kangaroo or exotic creature from a traveling menagerie. However, no missing animals were reported, and the gait did not match known species. Others proposed that the marks were made by badgers, foxes, otters, or mice, but these animals leave varied tracks that respond to terrain, something the Devon prints did not do. The tracks maintained form even across surfaces where animal movement would normally change. Another explanation involved weather. Some suggested that melting snow combined with hoof prints or debris could have created illusions. This idea fails to explain the consistent shape, spacing, and direction of the prints, as well as their appearance on rooftops and enclosed spaces. Human hoaxing has also been proposed, yet covering such a vast area in a single night without leaving evidence of interruption, repetition, or error would have required extraordinary coordination. No tools were found. No witnesses reported people moving across rooftops or fields overnight. The conditions were harsh, cold, and snowy, making such an effort unlikely without detection. Importantly, even skeptics at the time acknowledged the difficulty of the case. Scientific journals and local authorities attempted to offer explanations, but none gained wide acceptance. The phenomenon faded not because it was solved, but because the tracks eventually melted and life resumed. This lack of resolution allowed folklore to fill the gap. In Victorian England, religious imagery was deeply ingrained, and the idea of the devil walking the countryside resonated emotionally, even among those who did not fully believe it. The name stuck not as a claim of truth, but as an expression of confusion. When people lack categories, they reach for symbolism. From a modern perspective, the Devil's Footprints incident is unsettling not because it suggests something supernatural, but because it demonstrates how limited observation can be when evidence is transient. Snow preserves detail briefly and then erases it completely. By the time investigators could examine the tracks in full context, much of the physical evidence was already gone. Later attempts to recreate similar prints using animals, weather patterns, or mechanical devices have produced partial similarities, but none reproduce all reported features at once. Each explanation accounts for some details while failing others. This pattern is familiar in unresolved historical cases. What remains compelling is the consistency of early descriptions. Witnesses who had no reason to coordinate their stories described the same measurements, spacing, and behavior of the tracks. These were not vague impressions. They were specific observations made by people accustomed to reading tracks in rural environments. From a human perspective, the incident reveals how deeply unsettling it is when the environment behaves in ways that violate expectation. Footprints are among the most basic forms of evidence. We trust them. They tell us what passed through a place. When footprints appear that cannot be traced to a known source, they undermine a fundamental sense of order. The Devon footprints did not attack anyone. They did not damage property. They simply appeared and then disappeared, leaving behind unease rather than harm. This quietness is part of what makes the incident endure. There was no climax. There was no confrontation. There was no explanation. As this chapter closes, the Devil's Footprints incident remains a historical puzzle shaped by geography, weather, and human perception. It may one day receive a satisfying explanation, or it may remain an example of how rare conditions can produce effects that briefly escape understanding. What matters is not what the footprints were, but what they revealed about certainty. For one winter morning, something crossed the landscape of southern England and left marks that no one could confidently identify. Then, the snow melted, and with it went the chance to know for sure. The land returned to normal. The question did not. And in that quiet gap between observation and explanation, the mystery continues to walk forward, leaving no new tracks, but never fully disappearing. The Pyramids of Corral. Mystery. On the dry coastal plains of modern-day Peru, far from the dense jungles and stone cities most people associate with ancient South America, lies a landscape that quietly overturns one of archaeology's most comfortable assumptions. Scattered across the Soup Valley are massive platform pyramids, sunken circular plazas, and planned urban spaces that belong to a civilization older than the pyramids of Egypt, older than Stonehenge, and entirely unexpected in both form and behavior. This place is known as Corral, and its existence forces historians to rethink not just timelines, but the very conditions under which civilization can emerge. Corral dates back to roughly 3000 BCE, making it one of the earliest known urban centers in the world. At the time these pyramids were being constructed, writing had not yet appeared, pottery was absent, and metallurgy was unknown. And yet, the people of Corral built monumental architecture on a scale that required long-term planning, coordinated labor, and shared purpose across generations. This alone would be remarkable. What makes Corral truly unsettling is how it contradicts expectations. The pyramids of Corral are not tombs. They are not defensive structures. They are not monuments to kings whose names were carved into stone. Instead, they appear to have served communal and ceremonial purposes. Their construction involved layered stone and earth fill, bound together using woven bags called shikra, a method that increased stability and earthquake resistance. This technique shows sophisticated understanding of engineering, achieved without metal tools or wheeled transport. The city itself was carefully planned. Residential areas, ceremonial centers, and public spaces were clearly separated. Large sunken plazas suggest gatherings, performances, or rituals involving large numbers of people. The layout reflects intentional urban design rather than organic growth. And yet, there is something missing. Excavations at Corral have revealed almost no evidence of warfare. No weapons, no defensive walls, no mass graves, no fortifications. This absence is striking, especially when compared to other early civilizations, where conflict appears early and often. Corral seems to have developed complexity without relying on violence or military dominance. This challenges a long-standing assumption that competition and war are necessary drivers of early civilization. Instead, Corral appears to have been sustained by cooperation and trade. The Soup Valley itself is not particularly fertile, but it lies close to the Pacific coast. Evidence suggests that Corral's economy relied heavily on marine resources, such as fish and shellfish, traded inland for agricultural products like cotton, which was used to make fishing nets rather than food. This exchange network may have supported population growth without the pressures that typically lead to conflict. The absence of pottery also complicates interpretation. Pottery is often considered a hallmark of settled life, yet Corral thrived without it. Instead, containers were made from gourds and other organic materials that do not preserve well. This reminds us how much of ancient daily life may be invisible, simply because it was built from perishable materials. Music appears to have played an important role in Corral society. Archaeologists have found flutes made from pelican and condor bones, carefully crafted and tuned. These instruments suggest ritual, ceremony, and shared cultural expression rather than purely utilitarian activity. Sound, not writing, may have been one of the primary ways meaning was transmitted. There are also indications of social hierarchy, but not in the way we might expect. While some structures are larger and more elaborate than others, there is no clear evidence of royal palaces or elite burials filled with wealth. Power, if it existed, appears to have been expressed through control of ritual space, rather than accumulation of luxury goods. This points to a different model of authority. One of the most intriguing aspects of Corral is its longevity. The city was occupied for centuries, expanded, modified, and eventually abandoned. There is no clear evidence of sudden collapse, invasion, or environmental catastrophe. Instead, Corral seems to have declined gradually, perhaps as trade networks shifted or as populations moved to other regions. Like Mohenjo-Daro and other quietly abandoned sites, Corral does not offer a dramatic ending. Modern archaeology has only recently begun to understand the scale of the Corral civilization. For a long time, the pyramids were assumed to be natural hills, or much later constructions. It was only through systematic excavation and radiocarbon dating that their true age was revealed, forcing scholars to acknowledge that civilization in the Americas developed independently and far earlier than previously believed. Corral also challenges the idea that agriculture alone drives urbanization. While farming was present, it was not the dominant economic force. Instead, Corral demonstrates how trade, ritual, and shared ideology can bind communities together strongly enough to sustain large populations and monumental construction. From a human perspective, the pyramids of Corral are unsettling, not because they suggest lost technology or forgotten empires, but because they reveal how narrow our definitions of civilization have been. We expect writing, kings, armies, and pottery. Corral had none of these in recognizable form, and yet it functioned as a complex society for centuries. The city does not shout its importance. It sits quietly in the desert. Corral stands as evidence that human societies have always been more diverse in their paths than our models allow. Civilization did not begin once, in one place, following one formula. It emerged multiple times, under different conditions, driven by different priorities. The pyramids of Corral do not rewrite history through spectacle. They do so through contradiction. They exist where they should not, at a time when they should not, built by people who should not have been able to build them according to outdated assumptions. And in that contradiction lies their true mystery, not as an unsolved puzzle, but as a reminder that the past is far less predictable than we once believed. Çatalhöyük, the lost civilization without streets or kings. In the broad plains of central Anatolia, in modern-day Turkey, lies a mound that at first glance appears unremarkable, blending into the surrounding farmland without walls, towers, or monuments announcing its importance. Beneath this mound, however, is one of the most revealing and unsettling archaeological sites ever uncovered, a place that forces historians to rethink what a city is, how people once lived together, and whether hierarchy and centralized power were ever truly inevitable. This place is Çatalhöyük, and its story does not fit comfortably into any traditional model of early civilization. Çatalhöyük was occupied for nearly 1,000 years, beginning around 7,500 BCE, making it one of the earliest and largest known Neolithic settlements in the world. At its height, thousands of people lived there simultaneously, packed tightly together in a dense cluster of mud brick houses that formed a continuous mass rather than a city divided by streets. There were no roads, no alleys, and no open public squares in the conventional sense. Instead, people moved across rooftops and entered their homes through openings in the ceiling, descending by ladder into interior spaces. This arrangement was not accidental. It was deliberate, repeated, and maintained for centuries. The absence of streets immediately challenges assumptions about urban organization. Streets imply planning, authority, and regulation. Çatalhöyük functioned without them. Houses were built wall to wall, sharing boundaries, creating a city that was inward-facing rather than outward expanding. The rooftops served as communal space, pathways, and working areas, while the interiors remained private, controlled, and symbolically rich. Inside these houses, archaeologists discovered something even more unexpected. Walls were covered with paintings, reliefs, and symbolic imagery, depicting animals, hunting scenes, abstract patterns, and figures that remained difficult to interpret. These were not decorative flourishes added late in occupation. They were central to domestic life, repeatedly renewed, replastered, and repainted over generations. Religion, art, and daily living were not separated. They were embedded together. Another striking feature of Çatalhöyük is how the dead were treated. Burials took place beneath the floors of houses, often under sleeping platforms. Ancestors remained physically present within domestic space, integrated into daily life, rather than removed to distant cemeteries. Some skulls were removed, plastered, and reburied, suggesting complex ritual behavior tied to memory, identity, and lineage. Yet despite these elaborate practices, there is no clear evidence of kings, rulers, or elite classes. Excavations have not revealed palaces, temples distinct from houses, or concentrations of wealth that would indicate centralized authority. Houses are remarkably similar in size and structure. Tools, food domains, and artifacts are distributed relatively evenly. Differences exist, but they do not form a pattern of domination. This absence is not accidental, it is structural. Çatalhöyük appears to have operated as an egalitarian society on a scale previously thought impossible. Decisions were likely made at the household or community level, rather than imposed from above. Social cohesion may have been maintained through shared belief systems, ritual repetition, and strong cultural norms rather than coercion. This raises uncomfortable questions. If thousands of people live together without kings, armies, or formal governance structures, then hierarchy may not be as inevitable as once believed. Çatalhöyük suggests that early urban life could function through cooperation and shared identity rather than centralized control. The economy of the settlement reflects this as well. People farmed, herded animals, hunted, and traded over long distances. Obsidian from volcanic regions was worked and exchanged widely, showing participation in complex trade networks. Yet this economic activity did not result in visible wealth accumulation by a ruling class. Innovation existed without stratification. The city also shows remarkable continuity. Houses were built, abandoned, and rebuilt directly atop earlier ones, creating the mound that exists today. This vertical rebuilding was not random. New houses often followed the footprint of older ones, suggesting respect for ancestral space and continuity of place rather than constant expansion. When houses were abandoned, they were often carefully cleaned and sealed, not destroyed. This suggests ritual closure rather than crisis. Çatalhöyük did not collapse suddenly. There is no evidence of invasion, mass violence, or environmental catastrophe. Instead, the settlement gradually thinned as people dispersed into smaller communities across the region. Life continued elsewhere, carrying traditions forward rather than ending abruptly. From a human perspective, what makes Çatalhöyük so unsettling is not its age, but its implications. It reveals that many assumptions about progress are shaped more by later historical developments than by necessity. Writing, kingship, streets, and armies did not automatically appear as populations grew. Different choices were possible. The people of Çatalhöyük built a city that prioritized interior life, ritual continuity, and social balance over monumentality or expansion. They left no inscriptions declaring power, no statues commemorating rulers, and the Olmec civilization mystery. Deep in the humid lowlands along the Gulf Coast of Mexico, long before the rise of the Maya or the Aztecs, a civilization emerged that seemed to arrive without a clear beginning and vanish without leaving a written explanation. Archaeologists call this culture the Olmec, a name borrowed from later peoples because the Olmecs themselves left no readable texts, no king lists, and no direct accounts of who they were or how they understood their own world. What they did leave behind, however, reshaped the entire course of Mesoamerican history. The Olmec civilization flourished roughly between 1500 and 400 BCE, centered in regions that are now the modern states of Veracruz and Tabasco. This environment was challenging rather than welcoming. Dense forests, swamps, seasonal flooding, and oppressive heat made large-scale settlement difficult, and yet it was here that one of the earliest complex societies in the Americas took shape. What makes the Olmecs so difficult to understand is not just their antiquity, but the level of sophistication they display almost immediately in the archaeological record. When Olmec sites first appear, they are not tentative or experimental. They show advanced art, large-scale construction, long-distance trade, and complex religious symbolism from the outset, as if the culture emerged already mature. The most iconic legacy of the Olmecs is their colossal stone heads. Carved from massive blocks of basalt, some weighing over 40 tons, these heads were transported from distant quarries across rivers, wetlands, and uneven terrain without the use of metal tools, wheeled vehicles, or draft animals. The logistics alone required planning, coordination, and authority on a scale that implies a highly organized society. Each head is unique. Facial features differ, expressions vary, and headgear appears individualized. This suggests portraiture rather than generic symbolism. If these are rulers, then the Olmecs developed political leadership early. If they are ritual figures, then their religious system was already deeply structured. Either way, the labor invested in these monuments speaks of a society capable of mobilizing people toward shared goals. Beyond the heads, Olmec sites such as San Lorenzo and La Venta reveal carefully planned ceremonial centers, raised platforms, plazas, and earthen pyramids. These were not simple villages that grew organically. They were designed spaces with clear social and ritual functions. The presence of drainage systems and engineered landscapes indicates practical knowledge alongside symbolic ambition. Olmec art further complicates the picture. Figurines, carvings, and reliefs depict complex mythological themes, including human figures combined with animal traits, particularly jaguars. These images recur across sites, suggesting a shared belief system that extended beyond individual settlements. The consistency implies communication, tradition, and teaching across generations. And yet, there is no deciphered Olmec writing. Symbols appear on artifacts, but none have been conclusively identified as a full writing system. This absence leaves researchers unable to hear Olmec voices directly. We see what they built and carved, but not how they explain themselves. Trade networks reveal another layer of complexity. Olmec sites contain materials sourced from hundreds of kilometers away, including jade, obsidian, and magnetite. These materials were not random imports. They were selected deliberately and used in ritual contexts. This implies long-distance exchange relationships and shared cultural values with distant regions. Because of this influence, the Olmecs are often called the mother culture of Mesoamerica. Later civilizations inherited architectural styles, religious symbols, ballgame traditions, and cosmological ideas that appear to have Olmec origins. However, this label is debated because influence does not necessarily mean origin. The Olmecs may have been part of a broader cultural network rather than its sole source. What remains puzzling is how and why the Olmec centers declined. There is no clear evidence of conquest or sudden collapse. Some sites show signs of deliberate destruction, such as monuments being buried or broken, which suggests ritual closure rather than invasion. Environmental factors such as river shifts and flooding may have made certain locations unsustainable over time. Political or religious changes could have redirected populations elsewhere. Like several civilizations explored in this documentary, the Olmecs appear to have withdrawn rather than fallen. From a human perspective, the Olmec mystery lies in how complete their cultural footprint feels, despite the absence of narrative. They shaped art, religion, and power structures across a region for centuries, then faded into history without leaving words behind to explain their choices. Modern attempts to impose dramatic explanations often miss this quieter reality. The Olmecs were not necessarily lost, destroyed, or erased. They may have transformed, fragmented, or merged into later societies, carrying ideas forward even as distinct centers declined. The challenge is that archaeology captures outcomes, not intentions. We can measure stone, we can date earthworks, we can trace trade routes. What we cannot fully recover is meaning. As this chapter closes, the Baigong pipes and the question of ancient technology. On the edge of the Kaidam Basin in northwestern China, near a salt lake at the foot of Baigong Mountain, there is a cluster of objects embedded in rock that immediately challenges expectations about ancient technology. Protruding from the stone are dozens of rusted, pipe-like formations, some emerging horizontally from the mountainside, others running into the ground or toward the nearby lake. At first glance, they resemble industrial remnants, the kind of infrastructure associated with modern mining or water systems. Yet their location, composition, and context complicate any simple explanation. These objects have become known as the Baigong pipes. The pipes vary in diameter, from a few centimeters to nearly half a meter, and many appear hollow. Some extend deep into the rock face, while others lie scattered nearby, broken or partially exposed. Their surfaces are oxidized, giving them the reddish-brown appearance of corroded iron. What makes them puzzling is not just their shape, but the absence of any documented modern activity in the area that would account for their presence. The region around Baigong Mountain is remote, arid, and historically sparsely populated. There is no clear record of large-scale industrial operations, ancient or modern, that would explain why pipes would be embedded in solid rock in such a pattern. This lack of context has allowed speculation to grow rapidly, often outpacing careful analysis. Initial studies of the material showed that the pipes are not made of pure iron. Instead, they contain a mixture of iron oxides, silicon dioxide, and calcium oxide, with a significant portion of the material remaining unidentified. This composition led some early reports to suggest that the pipes could not be fully explained by known metallurgical processes, fueling claims of lost technology or non-human involvement. However, ambiguity does not equal confirmation. Further examination suggested that many of the pipes may not be pipes in the conventional sense at all. Some researchers propose that they are natural formations, created when mineral-rich water flowed through cracks in rock and gradually deposited material, forming tubular shapes over long periods of time. In this view, the pipes are geological features, not manufactured objects. This explanation is plausible, but it does not resolve every detail. Some of the Baigong pipes show what appear to be right angles, uniform diameters, and consistent hollow interiors, characteristics that are difficult to attribute entirely to natural processes. Additionally, their apparent organization, with multiple pipes aligned toward the lake, suggests intentional placement rather than random formation. There is also the issue of age. Some reports have claimed that the pipes date back tens of thousands of years, though these estimates are based on surrounding geological context rather than direct dating of the material itself. Without reliable dating methods applied specifically to the pipes, their age remains uncertain. This uncertainty is where interpretation becomes dangerous. The idea that the Baigong pipes represent ancient advanced technology is often presented without addressing the broader archaeological record. No tools, settlements, or cultural materials have been found nearby that would support the existence of a technologically advanced society capable of producing metal piping systems. Technology does not exist in isolation. It leaves behind waste, infrastructure, and patterns of use. At the same time, dismissing the pipes entirely as natural formations may be premature. Nature can produce surprising structures, but it rarely produces complexity that consistently mimics human design across multiple examples. The Baigong pipes occupy an uncomfortable middle ground where neither explanation fully satisfies. What complicates the situation further is the role of modern narrative. Once an object is labeled mysterious or anomalous, it attracts interpretations shaped more by expectation than evidence. Media coverage often emphasizes the most extraordinary possibilities while neglecting mundane but incomplete explanations. From a human perspective, the fascination with the bygone pipes reveals a deeper tension. We are uncomfortable with ambiguity. When an object does not fit neatly into existing categories, we tend to push it toward extremes, either declaring it revolutionary or dismissing it outright. Archaeology operates best in the space between those reactions. The most responsible position regarding the bygone pipes is not certainty, but restraint. They may represent a rare geological process that is not yet fully understood. They may be remnants of limited human activity that left no broader footprint, or they may be something else entirely that requires better methods and more thorough investigation. What is clear is that the pipes alone do not prove the existence of lost advanced civilizations or ancient industrial technology. At the same time, they remind us that the natural world can produce structures that challenge intuition, and that our interpretations are often shaped by what we expect to see rather than what is actually present. The bygone pipes are unsettling, not because they confirm extraordinary claims, but because they sit in a gray area that resists resolution. They look manufactured, yet lack context. They appear ancient, yet lack corroboration. They invite explanation, but punish certainty. As this chapter closes, the bygone pipes remain embedded in stone, exposed to wind and erosion, still quietly refusing to settle into a single story. They do not announce their origin. They do not explain their purpose. They simply exist, challenging both skepticism and speculation equally. In that sense, they belong exactly where they are, at the boundary between geology and archaeology, reminding us that not every mystery demands a dramatic answer, and that some questions remain open not because the truth is hidden, but because it is still incomplete. The Bronze Age collapse mystery, when the ancient world fell apart all at once. Around the end of the 13th century BCE, the ancient world experienced a breakdown so widespread and rapid that for centuries it was misunderstood as a series of unrelated local disasters rather than a single interconnected collapse. Powerful kingdoms vanished, cities that had stood for hundreds of years were destroyed or abandoned, long-distance trade networks disintegrated, writing systems disappeared, and entire regions entered periods of decline from which they would not recover for generations. This moment is now known as the Bronze Age collapse, and it remains one of the most complex and unsettling transitions in human history because it did not affect one civilization, but nearly all of them at the same time. Before the collapse, the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East were tightly connected. Egypt, the Hittite Empire, the Mycenaean kingdoms of Greece, city-states along the Levantine coast, and powers in Mesopotamia were linked through diplomacy, trade, and shared dependence on bronze, an alloy requiring both copper and tin sourced from distant regions. Letters traveled between kings, goods moved across seas, and stability depended not on isolation, but on cooperation. This interconnectedness created prosperity. It also created vulnerability. Archaeological evidence shows that within a relatively short span of time, many of these societies experienced catastrophic disruption. Major cities such as Mycenae, Pylos, Ugarit, and Hattusa were burned or abandoned. Administrative centers ceased operation. Palaces that had coordinated economic life disappeared. In some regions, literacy vanished entirely, leading to centuries without written records. Egypt survived, but barely. Records from the reign of Ramesses III describe invasions by groups later labeled the Sea Peoples, confederations of displaced populations moving by land and sea. Egyptian reliefs show battles against these groups, and while Egypt repelled them, the strain weakened the state permanently. The Hittite Empire did not survive at all. Its capital was abandoned, and its political structure collapsed so completely that for centuries its very existence was forgotten. The key problem in understanding the Bronze Age collapse is that no single cause explains it fully. Early theories focused on invasion, particularly by the Sea Peoples, but this explanation alone fails to account for the scale and simultaneity of the collapse. Invasion may explain destruction in some regions, but it does not explain systemic failure across diverse and distant societies. Environmental stress offers another layer. Paleoclimate data indicates periods of prolonged drought affecting the eastern Mediterranean around this time. Reduced rainfall would have led to crop failures, famine, and social unrest, placing enormous pressure on already complex systems. Drought does not destroy cities directly, but it weakens societies from within. Earthquakes have also been proposed as a factor. The region lies along major fault lines, and some cities show signs of seismic damage. A sequence of earthquakes could have compounded instability, damaging infrastructure and disrupting recovery efforts. However, earthquakes do not explain why trade networks collapsed or why writing systems disappeared. The most compelling explanations view the collapse as a systems failure rather than a single disaster. Bronze Age societies had become highly specialized and interdependent. Palaces controlled production, redistribution, and administration. When one link failed, others followed. If trade routes were disrupted, bronze could not be made. Without bronze, weapons and tools became scarce. Without tools, agriculture and defense suffered. Without food and security, populations moved. This created feedback loops that accelerated collapse. Social unrest likely played a role as well. Evidence of internal rebellion appears in some regions, suggesting that populations under stress may have turned against ruling elites. Palatial systems, once efficient, became brittle. They lacked resilience. One of the most striking aspects of the Bronze Age collapse is what followed. In many regions, populations declined sharply. Urban life retreated. Technology regressed. Pottery styles simplified. Monumental construction ceased. In Greece, this period is known as the Greek Dark Age, not because nothing happened, but because writing disappeared and left little record. And yet, life did not end. People adapted. Smaller communities replaced centralized states. New technologies emerged, including iron metallurgy, which did not rely on the same fragile trade networks as bronze. Over time, new political forms arose, laying the groundwork for the classical civilizations that followed. From a human perspective, the Bronze Age collapse is unsettling because it reveals how quickly complexity can unravel. These were not primitive societies. They were literate, organized, technologically capable, and deeply connected. Their failure was not due to ignorance, but to overdependence on systems that required stability to function. The collapse was not a single moment. It was a cascade. Modern comparisons are often tempting but unnecessary. The lesson does not require analogy. It is already clear in the archaeological record. Complexity creates power, but it also creates fragility. When stress exceeds adaptability, collapse can spread faster than any single society can contain. The Bronze Age collapse stands not as a mystery because we lack causes, but because no cause stands alone. It was invasion and drought and earthquakes and rebellion and systemic fragility interacting at once. The ancient world did not fall to one enemy, it fell to a convergence. And in that convergence lies one of history's most sobering reminders, that even the most interconnected and advanced societies can unravel rapidly when the systems that sustain them fail together, leaving silence where once there had been letters, cities, and kings.
A Dyatlov Pass incident. In February of 1959, deep in the northern Ural Mountains of the Soviet Union, a group of 9 experienced hikers set out on an expedition that was meant to be difficult but routine. They were young, physically fit, and well-trained in winter survival. Several were engineering students, others were recent graduates, and their leader, Igor Dyatlov, was respected for his discipline and preparation. Nothing about the group suggested recklessness, panic, or inexperience. And yet, within weeks, all 9 of them would be found dead under circumstances so strange that, more than 60 years later, no single explanation has fully resolved what happened. The expedition began normally. The group documented their journey carefully, keeping diaries, photographing their progress, and maintaining radio silence only where expected. Their goal was to reach a remote mountain pass during one of the harshest winters imaginable, a challenge that would qualify them for advanced hiking certification. Weather conditions were severe, but not unexpected for the region. These were conditions they had trained for. When the group failed to return on schedule, search teams were eventually sent out. What they discovered immediately shifted the situation from concern to confusion. The hiker's tent was found partially collapsed on a slope, but not buried by snow in a way that would suggest a catastrophic avalanche. More unsettling was the condition of the tent itself. It had been cut open from the inside, not unzipped, cut. This detail alone has fueled decades of speculation, because experienced hikers do not abandon shelter in sub-zero temperatures unless something forces them to do so immediately. Footprints leading away from the tent were visible in the snow. They were calm, spaced normally, and showed no signs of running or chaos. Some footprints were barefoot or in socks, despite temperatures that night likely dropping below -30 degrees Celsius. This suggests that whatever drove the hikers from their tent happened quickly, but not in a way that caused immediate panic. The first bodies were found near a tree line, about a kilometer from the campsite. 2 were dressed only in underwear and showed signs of having tried to build a small fire. Their hands were burned, possibly from exposure to flame or to desperate attempts to stay warm. Nearby branches were broken high up on a tree, suggesting someone had climbed it, possibly to look back toward the tent or to escape something on the ground. Between the tree and the tent, 3 more bodies were found, positioned as if they were attempting to return to the campsite. Their injuries were consistent with exposure and exhaustion rather than violence. This seemed to suggest that after whatever initial event occurred, some of the hikers believed returning to the tent was possible. The remaining 4 were not found until months later, buried under several meters of snow in a ravine. Their injuries were far more severe. Some had crushed ribs, skull fractures, and internal damage described as comparable to a high-impact collision, yet their skin showed little to no external trauma. One victim was missing her tongue and parts of her face, details that have been widely sensationalized, though natural explanations such as scavenging and decomposition cannot be ruled out. The distribution of clothing added another layer of confusion. Some of the hikers were found wearing clothing that belonged to others, suggesting that after the first deaths, survivors redistributed clothing in an attempt to stay alive. This indicates rational decision-making under extreme stress, not immediate irrational panic. Official investigations at the time concluded that the hikers died due to an unknown compelling force. The case was closed without a definitive explanation. Files were classified for decades, and when they were later reopened, the ambiguity remained. Over the years, theories have ranged from avalanches to military testing, from katabatic winds to infrasound-induced panic. Each explanation accounts for some details but struggles with others. Avalanches do not easily explain the tent cuts or calm footprints. Military tests lack physical evidence. Infrasound remains difficult to verify. Natural explanations exist, but none resolve every element cleanly. What makes the Dyatlov Pass incident endure is not the strangeness of any single detail, but the way all of them coexist. Rational behavior appears alongside extreme fear. Severe injuries appear without obvious causes. Experienced hikers make choices that seem illogical only if viewed without full context. Modern investigations using simulation models and terrain analysis have suggested that a small slab avalanche or snow instability could have triggered the initial flight from the tent without burying it completely. This explanation is currently favored by some researchers, yet even this does not fully account for the extent of injuries found later or the sequence of decisions made that night. The truth may lie in a combination of factors rather than a single event. Environmental conditions in the Urals can change rapidly. Snow, wind, darkness, terrain, and human physiology interact in ways that are difficult to reconstruct decades later. Once the hikers left their tent, survival became a rapidly closing window. From a human perspective, the most haunting aspect of the Dyatlov Pass incident is not mystery for its own sake, but the recognition that intelligent, capable people can still be overwhelmed by circumstances that leave little trace of what truly happened. The hikers left behind photographs, journals, and footprints, but the final moments of their lives remain unrecorded. This chapter does not exist to offer a sensational answer. It exists to establish a tone. Sometimes history does not fail because the truth is hidden, but because the final sequence of events unfolded too quickly, too quietly, and too far from witnesses to be fully reconstructed. The Dyatlov Pass incident remains unresolved not because it defies physics, but because it sits at the edge of what evidence can prove. It reminds us that even in the modern era, with documentation and investigation,